Steve Van Meter at Rebel Capitalist Live. Justin, let's get right into it.
Absolutely. So, Steve, you have an excellent presentation. Key points. The Fed wants inflation, but will be forced to retreat on rates. In other words, this is the same theme where it comes into the Fed's backed into a corner. Van Meter also notes that crypto, as it stands right now, is not an inflation hedge. Specifically, there's no recycling mechanism for that. In other words, when people get crypto or Bitcoin, the Bitcoin Maxi is a good example of this, they sit on their Bitcoin. They don't want to sell it. They don't want to recycle it back into the system. And that's perfectly understandable, particularly if you think, the world's going onto a Bitcoin standard, or that Bitcoin's just going to keep going up or go up over the long run. Anyways, the other thing he mentioned was that there is a demand, consumption, supply demographic moment of truth coming. More on that in a second. Anyways, getting on to crypto. His remarks on crypto is that, again, crypto is not an inflation hedge, at least not yet, and that Bitcoin, at least for right now, is not money. Van Meter would argue that money is three things, as you can see right here. It's got to be a store of value, and let's just say, while that the jury still might be out on that with Bitcoin being so volatile, let's just say Bitcoin could theoretically, still hold this. Unit of account, Bitcoin is clearly that, no issues on that front. And the medium of exchange. And this is where Van Meter said, no, not quite yet on that front. In any event, Bitcoin as it stands right now is not money, but it might be money in the future. Jury's still out. He talks about the central banks. And so when it comes to the centrals, they hate disinflation. The reason they hate disinflation is, think what Manarino says. Disinflation means that the weight of the debt gets heavier and heavier and heavier, and in a debt-based monetary system, this will crush the system. Likewise, inflation helps lighten the load in an over-leveraged system. The argument being is that in our over-leveraged system, which has led to market crashes, megacorps, poverty, and a bunch of other, social ills, you actually need to find a way to relieve the debt burden, to relieve the debt pressure. This is why centrals are so keen to get inflation, and why they're so skittish about the D word, that is disinflation or deflation. Very, very, very big problem if we have deflation. Anyways, he also said that we used to have disinflation, but now not so much in that regard. So what's the central's game plan? If inflation is desired, what do you do? Well, in the broadest of macro senses, you need for demand to be greater than supply. But the catch is that the centrals can't print supply. They can't print cars, they can't print widgets or whatever, right? They might be able to screw with demand, at least through a psychological aspect, which is where we're going to get to in just a second. And there is an argument to be made that the centrals can have some power if they have a handmaid in doing their dirty work. Again, not have to go down the money printing route, but if you have, let's say, the Fed or the government agreeing to buy back, PPP loans or whatever, right? That way the commercial banking system can make loans, knowing they can basically just swap them back at a 1-to-1 ratio without any risk. So you can use the central bank, or you can use the commercial banks to print the money into the system, and then the Fed or the government just basically buys it back. The Fed's printing money, but again, they've got to have that handmaiden to do that. Let's talk about demographics. The boomers is a generation they want to consume, and boomer consumption led to outsourcing. This started the export of dollars, per Van Meter's argument. So think like circa probably the 70s and the 80s is where you first saw this coming online. Anyways, the dollar exports necessitated mass deficits. So if you have a deficit, not the give back, but the logical conclusion of that is you have the export of dollars in order to import whatever stuff you're buying, cheap garbage from China, Japanese cars, Mercedes from Germany, whatever. But the big picture, the macro picture is that nonetheless, the stuff that was imported into America led to the hollowing out of the industrial middle class, but it also supplied the world with the dollars that it needed. Anyways, the point is that the boomers want to consume, and they are a major demand source. And also bear in mind what we just said before, if you're dealing with the inflation, you need demand to be greater than supply. So in other words, you've got to kind of bear this in mind, that the boomers are a major demand source, and this is going to come into the future. Anyways, looking forward, you have, at least as it stands right now, a supply failure. The boomers are retiring, but their demand is not subsiding, and there's not enough of the rest of us to pick up their slack. Potential for demand to be greater than supply, as we, as the non-boomers, lack the manufacturing capacities to satiate boomer demand and deal with the boomers that are in retirement. Now, it's also to note that Joseph Wing touched on this in his presentation, dealing with the demographics on this, and Gregory Manarino will touch on this as well from time to time. And I believe even Jeff Snyder talked on it, or touched on it as well in his presentation. Anyways, we'll get to those in the later videos. But the point is that when the boomers retire, you have an issue on the supply side where supplies being sucked, or the production of supplies are being sucked out of the market, according to Van Meter. But at the same time, the boomer demand is still pedal to the metal on full throttle. So the Fed's solution to this is that the Fed needs inflation to lighten the debt load, but not too much at once. So if a recession comes along to wipe out the wealth of the boomers, this diminishes their spending ability. If you diminish the boomers' spending ability, you diminish the boomers' demand, or at least you force the demand to be curtailed. People feel less wealthy or whatever, right? And, whatever. But the point is, if you draw down demand, it eases inflation, but it still allows for palpable inflation. Because I don't think, and this is me trying to put words in Van Meter's mouth, and I might not be getting this right, but this is the vibe that I got. The Fed needs inflation. It must have inflation, but it knows that if it has too much inflation too quickly, there's going to be problems. Likewise, if there's not enough inflation, it might peter out and it falls back into disinflation. Thus, there's a very narrow path the Fed must walk with disaster on each side. It's kind of the take on it. If the Fed can't manage, or if the boomer demand remains too hot, this has the potential to run inflation too hot. And while the Fed would like more inflation than less inflation, they can't have too much inflation where the rest of the populace, cries out in pain and demand something else to be changed. To quote Rickards, if it's too bad, people are going to grab a bunch of pitchforks, walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, and burn down the Fed. An amusing prospect, but nonetheless, I'm sure the Fed is cognizant of that situation too. Anyways, but if you allow asset prices to deflate, so that is stocks to come down, real estate to come down, and this is where you get, I think, the concept of Jerome Powell's soft landing, you can presumably check in a gentle way, if you can use that word, or maybe it's better to say you have a brass fist in a velvet glove. You're able to make people, particularly the boomers, feel poor if you assume that the boomers have the majority of the wealth stored in equities or stored in real estate or other investment products. The point is, if they feel less wealthy, then they will consume less. If they consume less, you deal with the demand situation. If you bring down demand, particularly in the face of falling supply due to structural issues, the Fed would still be achieving its objectives of having inflation, but not too much inflation where they have a political problem, and not potentially running into disinflation as well, which in a debt-based system will make the debt load further, which will further exacerbate the burden of the debt load. Anyways, Josh, follow-up question.
This was Steve Van Meter at Rebel Capitalist Live. If you want to see the rest of the speakers, you have to share this video at least 10 times or we will not do another one. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next one.